Okay, so let's think about emotions, right? So if I am walking down the street and let's say I reach out to pet a dog, and if I pet a dog and the dog like nips at me, I feel fear. And then if I'm a kid, I may start crying, and then mommy or daddy picks me up, and then 5 minutes later, I feel totally fine because mommy or daddy has distracted me, gives me ice cream, whatever. But then if you sort of look at it, the next time I see a dog, I will have a physiologic response. I will feel afraid of the dog, even if the dog is across the street. So in a very, very simple sense, if we look at the way that we learn and the way that the trauma works, so we have a negative experience, and oftentimes we do not process that experience. It simply goes dormant. And so the next time that I see the dog, the fear comes rushing back because it's living in my mind. Did I do something to cause this? What's going on with the dog? Maybe I should be a little bit more careful. So what you do, what you literally do is you take that emotion and then you look at it from different perspectives. This is also what we do in psychotherapy. When someone has let's say they have a bunch of shame, we'll ask the question, okay, where does that shame come from? How do you feel about that? What are the different ways that you can look at it? And if you sort of look at it, the other thing that happens with shame is we start to develop identities of ourselves. So there's the emotion of shame, and then we start to form conclusions about ourselves. Like, I feel ashamed in this moment, and then that becomes, I am a terrible human being. I'm a loser, right? Now this becomes a statement of fact that has a life that is independent of the shameful experience. So when we talk about processing shame, there is some amount of emotional work, but then there's also work on the ego level, or the ahamkara is what it's called in Sanskrit, where our emotional experiences result in conclusions that we form about ourselves. And so those conclusions need to be re-examined. And the most damning thing is that when we are emotional, we form very powerful conclusions, but since we're emotional, they're more likely to be wrong. And if anyone has gone through a breakup, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because you go through all these conclusions in your head. This person is terrible, women are terrible, I'm terrible, I'll never find love again. You form all these conclusions from an emotional state. But those conclusions don't go away when literally the emotional circuitry of our brain reaches homeostasis or equilibrium. Those learnings stay with us. So, and I think sort of dealing with this deals with all three. So we want to reduce the emotion in the moment, and then we want to critically look at the conclusions that we've drawn about the world. And then the last thing that we really want to do is pay attention to how do these conclusions become automatic behaviors. And then if we want to change those behaviors, then we need to look at our sense of our identity as well as our emotional experience. So let's say I go eat at a restaurant 5 times, right? And it's my favorite restaurant. The 6th time I go, I get food poisoning. So if we look at like what happens, if you get food poisoning once, your brain does not calculate, okay, 15% of the time we get food poisoning, so we should be able to eat there. All it takes is one negative experience to bias all of our recollections of the past. And that's a survival mechanism, right? So let's think about like when we were evolving, let's say I go to a watering hole to get water, but the 6th time I go, a crocodile jumps out at me. It is of a lot of benefit for my survival if I go back and question the last 5. Did I get lucky? Was that actually safe? Who knows? So one of the things that we know, and there's a fascinating field of science which is emerging now called neuroeconomics. And neuroeconomics is fascinating because it looks at all of these cognitive biases that we have, especially around negative experiences. And one of the things that we learned is that the human brain doesn't want to perceive reality. It wants to adjust reality for the benefit of survival. And I'll give you just a really interesting and terrifying example of that. So our brain, when we look at, let's say I'm going to ask a girl out on a date, okay? So our brain, when I think about asking the girl out on the date, the dopaminergic centers of my brain, the nucleus accumbens, the place that I feel pleasure. So if I ask her out and she says yes, I feel an exhilaration of pleasure. The dopaminergic circuits of my brain in a hypothetical yes do not activate. But the negative emotional circuitry in my brain can activate and actually make me suffer based on a hypothetical. So if you've ever been in this situation and you think about how things go wrong, that's not a hypothetical. You can feel the pain of a future loss today, but you cannot feel the the pleasure of winning an award or getting a trophy today. Like literally, hypotheticals can activate your negative emotional circuitry in the present, but they do not activate your dopaminergic circuitry. And we didn't know this even 10 years ago, because now we know so much about human behavior, we know so much about neuroscience, that we can actually look at some of these behaviors that people have where people are very risk averse, right? And we know what the neuroscience of it is. So we know, for example, that like estrogen makes us more aware of our internal emotional state. So this is part of the reason why women will have a fluctuating emotional experience. I don't think this is good or bad, it's just what happens. So I think for men, the answer is a little bit different because we are conditioned to experience emotions in a certain way. So for men, I think the best way to reconnect with your emotions is through your body. And interestingly enough, through your rational mind. So there's a fascinating study, and I can send you all the reference, where a group of researchers basically looked at, they had people map out physical sensations when they are feeling an emotion. So if you think about butterflies in the stomach, a lump in my throat, it feels like I got kicked in the balls, heartache, right? So we actually have a somatic map. When anytime we have an emotion, remember, an emotion is not mental. Nothing is just mental. Everything is physiological too. So one of the best things that you can do, and this is like literally a sequence that I go through, is oftentimes we as men don't know that we're feeling emotions. Like even when we're feeling, we don't feel them, but they're active. That's the way I would put it. So what I'd have people do is ask them to pay attention to your body. What do you feel in your body? Where do you feel tightness? Where do you feel discomfort? Do you feel jittery? Do you feel like wiggling around? So zone into that. And it's beautiful how good men are at this. So the second question, that you write it down, really pay attention to what you're feeling. And then ask yourself a hypothetical. If another person were feeling these things, what emotion do you think they could be feeling? If someone's feeling butterflies in the stomach and pain in their chest and tightness in their throat, what emotions do you think those could be? And this is where our rational mind kicks in. Maybe that's sadness, maybe that's anxiety, maybe that's worry, maybe that's love. And then something beautiful happens. Do you think you could be feeling those things? And then people will say, oh my God, yeah, I'm feeling all of those things. And this is what makes it so hard, is that if we don't know, if we haven't been trained in our emotions, what makes it hard to isolate emotions is that frequently we feel many of them at the same time, and many of them in ways that feel conflicted, right? So when I get dumped, what do I feel? I feel love, I feel grief, I feel sadness, I feel hopeless, I feel relieved, right? At least it's over now, but we're not aware because it's so complex. So I'd say start with your body, really ask yourself some of these questions, and then you'll be amazed at how far you can get. So alexithymia is a I guess, clinical term that means color blindness to your internal emotional state. So this is exactly what I'm talking about, is if you ask a dude, like, what do you feel? Like, anytime you ask a dude, like, what do you feel? They're going to say pissed, right? So if I'm getting bullied, how do you feel? Oh man, like, screw that guy. If you ask someone out and they say no, oh, screw her. The only emotion that we're really aware of, that we're feeling. And if you ask guys, how's life going? Oh, it's frustrating. So as men, we're kind of conditioned to feel one emotion, which is anger. And there's all kinds of other emotions underneath anger. So what we call an inability to detect your internal emotional state is something called alexithymia. Now, there's even research on something called normative male alexithymia. So normative meaning it is normal. Why is it normative male alexithymia? Because this is actually most men are alexithymic. This is what we've discovered. And it's because of the way that we're raised, maybe because of testosterone, who knows? I mean, who knows how much of it is nature, nurture? But most men are not really aware of what they're feeling. And so then they'll say, I don't feel a whole lot of emotions. Like, I'll talk to people who will say, like, I'm a robot, or they strive to have ice in their veins.
Yes.
Right? So we even like glorify the lack of emotional experience. The problem is that being numb to something does not mean that it doesn't exist, right? So if I give you lidocaine and I give you anesthesia and you can't feel anything, and I literally cut into your belly is open. Just because you don't feel it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And this is also where we see technology, because now what we're seeing is an evening out between men and women for alexithymia, primarily due to technology, is my belief. So technology, all forms of technology will suppress our negative emotional circuitry, so we're all becoming more alexithymic. As we become alexithymic, now we're in huge problems, because just because you're not aware of the emotion doesn't mean that the emotion doesn't act. And this is why people are so confused about why their life is a certain way. Why can't I get up in the morning? Why can't I just apply for a promotion? Why can't I set limits with this person? And what's literally going on is you have a huge inferno of emotions that are restricting your behaviors that you're numb to. And so you don't realize what's going on, but what people feel is just paralyzed and stuck. And they don't realize why they can't be like these other people that are disciplined and hardworking. Like, why am I not like this? Why can't I just get out of bed and do what I need to do? Well, there's something else that is motivating you to not do that. And that's usually an emotion that you're blind to. So I think it's good to talk about negative emotions. And we have to understand even the mechanism of it. So here's something to understand. So anything that is left in the mind will compound. So if you take a patient who has been traumatized, right? So let's say I've had patients who've been abused in their upbringing. And what happens is, oftentimes what happens in abusive relationships, in abusive households, is there's secrecy. So what does secrecy do? What secrecy does is it compounds whatever is on the inside. So in trauma, what we see is an incredible healing ability if we ventilate what is in there. We kind of let it out, and then literally the energy in the mind decreases. Anytime you say something, it gets taken out of your mind and gets vented to the ether. Now, the really interesting thing is this is true of positive things as well. So I don't know if you know people who talk big, right? So they have all this excitement about all this stuff that they're gonna do. They have this great idea for a startup. They have a great idea for a book. I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that. They're full of hot air. And what's happening is they have all of this energy and they're venting it out, and then they never accomplish anything. So even if you look at this deep spiritual tradition of mantra, tantra. So mantra is meant to be kept secret. And what a mantra really is, here's my kind of understanding of it, is it's the same principle as a trauma kept secret, except it's a positive thing. So when you have something that is positive, that is within you, that you keep within you and you do not vent to the world, it can be incredibly motivating. So Freud made a really interesting discovery that language is a substitute for action. And what we know from psychotherapy is if you have someone in your office who has homicidal ideation, they want to kill another human being. Literally what happens is if they're able to share their feeling about wanting to kill another human being, that actually reduces their homicidality. Something about speaking about it substitutes for action in your brain. So the two become interchangeable. So whatever you want to cultivate within you, keep within yourself.